Okay guys, here we go. Car of the day, Chrysler Town & Country. Came in with a Parasitic draw. Vehicle would die overnight. We plugged in the multimeter. As you can see, this one was a very interesting diagnostic. We have an amp. We have a draw of over an amp, and the problem with this draw is it would fluctuate back and forth. So see, it would drop down to 0.2 amps and then go back up and so on, just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, what we did, we started unplugging every single fuse one by one until we figured out, what would cause the actual draw. So I'll jump straight to it. This fuse, 20 amp, I think it was let me see, M13. With this fuse unplugged, let's see what happens to this. And the draw, it's coming down. There we go, we're down to 30 milliamps, which is perfect for this car. I mean, anything 50, 60, 70, even 70 I'm okay with. Is pretty acceptable for a car like this. Now, our next step was to go look at the wiring diagrams, the power distribution, of course. I have one printed. It's kind of in black and white, but I mean, it says what we need. So, all right, if I can get the camera to focus, our fuse M13 here supplies two things: steering column module and instrument cluster. So our next step was to gain access to both of them. Well, the cluster would be very tough to gain access to because you got to remove part of the dash. So our initial thing is we gain access to the steering control module. The steering control module is just a multi-function switch on these. We unplug the connectors on that, mainly the connector that has that red wire, and I'll show you where it's at. So, as you can see, we have the whole car torn apart, the whole dash, because this issue is pretty complicated, to say the least. Now, I'm just going to make it simple for you. This is the steering column. These are the connectors you need to unplug. 1, 2, 3. You unplug these, and then if your draw, which these are unplugged already, if your draw remains the same, which let's check to see. Well, actually we got the fuse unplugged, but I'll plug the fuse back in here in a second. So I was able to plug the fuse back in, as you can see. Back to my multimeter, the draw came right back up again. So now, the only other denominator in this is the instrument cluster. So, you gotta tear out the dash for that. It's quite a bit of labor. We get to the instrument cluster, correct? And I mean, these wires here are gonna give you a hint. But anyways, what you wanna do is there's two connectors on the cluster, and you wanna unplug them, and you wanna see which connector. You want to unplug the cluster ideally and see if that draw goes away. So if we unplug the cluster, and we unplug this other one, look at what happens to our draw. It's still high, but give it a second. Because by unplugging the cluster, you just woke up the system. So, it's coming down. Give it a little bit longer. There we go. Pretty much drops down to 10 milliamps. I mean, that's because the cluster is completely out of the system. So, anyways, We initially thought cluster. It's keeping it staying awake, blah blah blah, but no. The cluster is staying awake. The fluctuation, we found out that it's actually, here I'll go to the instrument cluster diagrams. The fluctuation we found out is the instrument cluster, the first two wires, right, the computer data lines, and CAN bus is keeping the cluster awake. Now, what we did, there's two connectors on the cluster. There's connector C2 here. Let me see if I can zoom in. There we go. Okay, we got connector C2 and connector C1. Now, you want to figure out, first you want to unplug every connector. You want to plug one connector at a time. Now, when you unplug connector C1, the draw goes away. When you unplug connector C2, the draw does not go away. So let me go, I'll show you guys, I'll unplug them one by one, and I'll show you what's happening. So, okay. With just one connector unplugged, you hear a sound. And let's look at our jack, see what's happening. The connector that we currently have unplugged, this connector C2 is unplugged. And C1 is plugged in. Our draw has dropped down to 0.02. And now we only have C2 to focus on. So we know all of C1, we're good. We have no problems with. So C2, let me tell you what's going on. Pin number 1 is the glove box lamps. Pin number 2 is courtesy lamps. And then we got pin number 3 and pin number 6 are grounds. Pin number 10 is the power. And pin number 9 is interior lights, and here are the reading lamps. So what you want to do, check the grounds. I mean, obviously grounds are going to be good if you got, it's good to check them, but we check the grounds are good. We check the fuse power, obviously the fuse power is good, we have no problem there. Now we're left with these panel lamps, courtesy lamps, and the reading lamps. So to go off, and these are pins on C2, they are pins number 2, pins number 5, and pins number 9. And pin number 1, actually, sorry. Now, before we even get into this, we checked every single interior light to make sure no lights were on, no buttons were pushed, everything was in place. And everything was in place. So this is why this was kind of stupid. But anyways, we'll go to the courtesy lamps. So, courtesy lamp circuit. Now we are worried about connector C2. Here's the problem with it. Here's the problem with these connectors. These connectors, I mean these pins, you got the reading lamps, which is pin number 5. If you look at it, it moves on to number 2 here. And then from here, let's see. It goes on to, from number 2, the yellow and light blue continues on here, and it goes here. Moves on to the next page. Now there's two options, whether you have a sunroof, 3 and 4, whether you have a sunroof or not in this car. This car has a sunroof. Either way, I don't think the options matter. They ideally go to the same place, but it all depends on the connectors and the splitters. So splices, sorry. Now, they go to the second and third row overhead rail lamps. What I'm trying to explain is these other pins that are left over on the instrument cluster, if you were to look at the diagram, they all go to multiple lamps in the interior. Now, there's a couple ways of doing this. You can go and disconnect each lamp one by one, or you can depin the connector. I'll show you the connector. You can, this connector here, you can remove this white piece. This is what holds all the pins in place, and then pry every single pin out one by one, out of those pins that we talked about, the ones that are responsible for the lighting. So, we didn't do that. I don't like doing that because sometimes they're very easy to damage, and if you do damage them, it's very tough to, you can get a pin to move, and you plug everything back together, and all of a sudden intermittently customers got problems, and it just makes everything worse. For me, I can solder these wires very well, so I start cutting all these wires instead of having to unplug everything one by one. I cut all these wires, and when I cut pin number 5, which was for the dome lamps, the draw went away. So I'll show you now. Let me undo this wire. I haven't soldered it yet. There we go. Connector plugged in. Wire number 5 undone. I draws back up because our cluster's awake. Give it a few seconds, it'll drop down. Anyways, we'll wait for this to drop down. So we'll go back to our courtesy lamps, and we said pin number 5 is the problem. So let's see here, pin number 5. Alright, so pin number 5 was this yellow and blue wire, which we traced down, and eventually goes to here, to these dome lamps. So our next step is to go over to the dome lamps, and I'll show you what we have to do. So we are sitting at the dome lamps, guys. These are the actual dome lamps right here, 1 and 2. And every time I would press these on and off, they would come on fine, no problems. And they would go off just fine, no problems. So the way these panels come down, all they have is clips. Clip here, clip here, clip here, clip here. Obviously you don't have to pull the whole panel down. So what we did, these are the 4 dome lights that are on the diagram. What we did is we unplugged the first one, draw remained there. We unplugged the second one, and draw remained there. We went to the rear ones, 3rd row, and we did the same thing. We unplugged this one, draw remained. We unplugged this one, draw went away. So this is actually the problem. This dome light, even though the light is off, the switch is partially staying engaged. So because the switch is partially staying engaged, you got this wire goes directly back to the cluster, and I think the cluster is the initiator on all these lamps. So because the cluster is the initiator and this is partially staying engaged, it's keeping the cluster awake, which is then keeping the CAN bus awake, which is causing the draw. And the CAN bus being awake, every time it sends a message, the draw fluctuates up. Every time the CAN bus goes quiet for a few seconds, it comes down to 200 milliamps, and so on. So we got this unplugged. As you can see, we'll go over to our meter, and we'll see what's happening. We have that unplugged, back at our meter, look at that, 30 milliamps of draw. So there we go, our problem. Dome light switch, 3rd row, stuck partially on, keeping cluster awake, causing all these issues. Now, it'd be very easy to replace, just call the cluster as faulty on this, replace the cluster, you're gonna have the same exact problem. So if you're having a parasitic draw, it's your fuse M13 that's drawing power, you might want to look into this, because I got a feeling this is a common issue. So thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I hope you're having a good day.